At 11:42 p.m. on March 24, 1944, Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade made a decision that should have killed him instantly. He was standing in the burning wreckage of a Lancaster bomber's rear turret at 18,000 feet over Germany. Flames were consuming his parachute, his flight suit was on fire, and he had maybe 10 seconds before the aircraft exploded. Alkemade looked down at the flames, looked out at the darkness below, and jumped without a parachute. He fell 18,000 feet through freezing night air and survived with nothing more than a sprained ankle and minor burns. This is the story of how one airman's split-second decision to ditch his burning gear led to the most remarkable survival in aviation history. Nicholas Alkemade was 21 years old in March 1944, a tail gunner with 115 Squadron RAF Bomber Command. He'd flown 14 combat missions over Germany, and every single one had been terrifying. The rear gunner position in a Lancaster bomber was the most dangerous job in the most dangerous branch of the RAF. You sat alone in a glass turret at the very back of the aircraft, isolated from the rest of the crew. The turret was cramped, freezing cold, and offered no armor protection whatsoever. When German night fighters attacked, they came from behind and below, which meant they shot at the tail gunner first. RAF statistics showed that rear gunners had a 44% chance of being killed before completing their tour of 30 missions. Alkemade knew these numbers, every rear gunner did, but he never talked about them. On the night of March 24, 1944, Alkemade's Lancaster S for Sugar took off from Mildenhall Airfield in Suffolk. The target was Berlin, a 9-hour round trip deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The mission briefing had been tense because Berlin raids always had the highest casualty rates. German flak batteries ringed the city with hundreds of guns, and night fighter squadrons prowled the approach routes. Alkemade climbed into his rear turret at 8:30 p.m., settling into the tiny space that would be his world for the next 9 hours. He wore electrically heated flight suits, sheepskin boots, leather gloves, and an oxygen mask. His parachute pack was stowed in a rack inside the fuselage, not worn on his back. This was standard procedure, because the turret was too cramped to wear a parachute while operating the guns. If the crew needed to bail out, Alkemade would have to rotate the turret, crawl back into the fuselage, grab his parachute, clip it on, and then jump. In an emergency, that process took at least 30 seconds if everything went perfectly. Lancaster S for Sugar climbed to 18,000 feet and joined the bomber stream heading east across the North Sea. Alkemade scanned the darkness behind the aircraft, watching for the telltale exhaust flames of German night fighters. The temperature in the turret was -40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause frostbite in minutes. His breath froze on the inside of his oxygen mask, and ice crystals formed on the gun breeches. The outbound flight was uneventful, but Alkemade knew the danger would come after the bombing run. German fighters waited for the bombers to leave the target area, then attacked when the crews were exhausted and low on fuel. At 11:20 p.m., S for Sugar dropped its bomb load over Berlin and turned for home. Alkemade saw fires burning across the city below, thousands of incendiaries setting entire neighborhoods ablaze. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Jack Newman, increased speed and began the long flight back to England. They were 30 minutes past Berlin when Alkemade saw something that made his blood freeze. Twin exhaust flames about 800 yards behind them, slightly below. A German night fighter closing fast. Alkemade pressed his microphone switch and called out, "Fighter behind 600 yards, coming up fast." Newman immediately threw the Lancaster into a corkscrew, a violent evasive maneuver that threw the aircraft into a diving spiral. The G-forces slammed Alkemade against the side of the turret as the bomber twisted through the night sky. He kept his eyes on the fighter, calling out its position as Newman maneuvered to avoid its guns. The German pilot was good, staying with the Lancaster through the corkscrew, closing the distance steadily. At 400 yards, Alkemade opened fire with his 4 Browning 303 machine guns. The guns hammered, tracers reaching out toward the fighter, but the range was still too long for accurate shooting. The German fighter was a Junkers Ju-88, a twin-engine night fighter equipped with upward-firing cannons. The pilot slid underneath the Lancaster's belly, where Alkemade couldn't see him, positioning for a perfect shot. Alkemade yelled a warning, but there was nothing Newman could do. The fighter was in the blind spot. At 11:35 p.m., the German pilot opened fire with his upward-firing 20mm cannons. The shells ripped through the Lancaster's fuselage, tearing through metal and setting fuel lines ablaze. Alkemade felt the impact shudder through the aircraft, heard the explosions as shells detonated inside the fuselage. Then he saw flames, bright orange flames streaming from holes in the fuselage ahead of his turret. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by hydraulic fluid and oxygen from ruptured lines. Within seconds, the entire rear section of the Lancaster was engulfed in flames. Newman's voice came over the intercom, calm but urgent. Abandon aircraft, bail out now." Alkemade rotated his turret to the side position and tried to crawl back into the fuselage to retrieve his parachute. But the space between the turret and the fuselage interior was a solid wall of fire. He could see his parachute pack through the flames, still in its rack, but there was no way to reach it. The heat was incredible, searing his face even through his oxygen mask. His electrically heated flight suit had caught fire in several places, small flames burning through the fabric. Alkemade tried to beat out the flames with his gloved hands, but the fire kept spreading. He looked at the parachute again, knowing with absolute certainty that he couldn't reach it. The fire was too intense, and even if he could somehow get through the flames, the parachute was probably already burning. Alkemade faced a choice that no human being should ever have to make. He could stay in the turret and burn to death, which would take maybe 30 seconds of unimaginable agony. Or he could jump from 18,000 feet without a parachute and die instantly on impact. Burning to death terrified him more than falling. At least the fall would be quick. He rotated the turret to face backward, opened the turret doors and looked down at the darkness below. He couldn't see the ground, just blackness, and he had no idea what he was falling toward. The flames were licking at his legs now, burning through his flight suit and searing his skin. Alkemade pulled off his burning gloves and threw them into the darkness. Then he pulled off his helmet with the oxygen mask still attached and threw that away too. He kicked off his heavy sheepskin flying boots, letting them tumble away into the night. He didn't know why he was ditching his gear. There was no conscious thought behind it. Some instinct told him that getting rid of weight and bulk might somehow help, even though logic said nothing could help. He was about to fall 3.5 miles without a parachute. Ditching gear wasn't going to save him. But his hands kept moving anyway, stripping off equipment, throwing pieces into the void. The Lancaster was tilting now, the nose dropping as the fire consumed the control cables. Alkemade knew the aircraft would explode any second. The fuel tanks were directly above the fire. At 11:42 p.m., Nicholas Alkemade pushed himself out of the turret and fell into the darkness. The wind hit him like a physical blow, ripping at his burning flight suit. He was tumbling, spinning, completely disoriented with no sense of up or down. The air temperature was -40 degrees, but he barely felt it because his body was flooded with adrenaline. Above him, he caught glimpses of the Lancaster still burning, falling in a slow spiral. Then it exploded, a bright orange fireball that lit up the night sky for miles. Alkemade was falling at terminal velocity now, approximately 120 miles per hour. At that speed, he would hit the ground in about 90 seconds. He stopped tumbling somehow and found himself falling in a stable, flat position, face down. The wind screamed past his ears, and he could barely breathe in the 120-mile-per-hour slipstream. His flight suit was still smoldering in places, small flames extinguished by the wind, but the fabric still glowing hot. His hands and face were exposed to the freezing air, and within seconds his skin went numb. He couldn't see the ground, couldn't see anything except blackness below. There was no sense of movement, no reference points, just the wind and the cold and the knowledge that death was seconds away. Alkemade later said he felt strangely calm during the fall, no fear, no panic. He'd made his choice, accepted his fate, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the impact. He thought about his family, his mother and father back in Loughborough. He thought about his girlfriend Betty, wondered if she'd ever know what happened to him. He thought it was a shame that he'd never get to marry her, never get to have the life they'd planned. These thoughts flashed through his mind in fragments, disconnected images with no emotional weight. He was falling through 15,000 feet, then 12,000, then 10,000. His ears popped as the air pressure increased, and his breathing became easier. At 8,000 feet, he began to feel warmer as he fell into thicker air. At 5,000 feet, he could see vague shapes below him, darker patches in the blackness. Trees, he realized. He was falling toward a forest. He had maybe 25 seconds left before impact. What Alkemade didn't know was that he'd jumped over the Ruhr Valley in western Germany. The area below him was the Mönchengladbach forest, thousands of acres of dense pine trees. It was late March, and there had been heavy snowfall across Germany that week. The forest floor was covered with approximately 18 inches of fresh snow. These two factors, trees and snow, were about to save Alkemade's life in ways he couldn't possibly understand. At 3,000 feet, Alkemade saw the treetops rushing up at him with terrifying speed. He instinctively pulled his arms and legs in, curling into a ball. At 2,000 feet, he could see individual branches, dark lines against the snow below. At 1,000 feet, he realized he was going to hit the trees, and he closed his eyes. Nicholas Alkemade slammed into the upper branches of a pine tree at approximately 120 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic, but it wasn't instantly fatal. The first branch he hit was relatively thin, and it snapped on impact, barely slowing him down. But it deflected his trajectory slightly, changing his angle as he plunged deeper into the tree. He hit a second branch, thicker this time, and it bent under his weight before breaking. Each branch he hit slowed him incrementally, shaving off a few miles per hour of velocity. The pine branches were flexible, bending before breaking, which absorbed energy that would otherwise have been transferred to his body. Alkemade was spinning now, tumbling through the branches, completely out of control. He felt impacts all over his body, branches hitting his arms, legs, back, head. His flight suit snagged on branches multiple times, jerking him violently before the fabric tore. He plummeted through 60 feet of pine branches, hitting dozens of them, each one slowing him slightly. By the time he broke through the lowest branches, his velocity had decreased from 120 miles per hour to perhaps 40, still fast enough to kill but no longer instantly fatal. Alkemade fell the final 20 feet through open air and crashed into the snow-covered forest floor. The 18 inches of fresh snow compressed under the impact, creating a cushioning effect. Beneath the snow was a thick layer of pine needles and forest debris, soft and springy. Alkemade's impact created a crater in the snow 3 feet deep. And then everything went black. Nicholas Alkemade regained consciousness at 3:20 a.m., nearly 4 hours after he hit the ground. He opened his eyes and saw stars through a hole in the forest canopy above him. For several seconds he had absolutely no idea where he was or what had happened. Then memory flooded back. The burning Lancaster, the jump, the fall. He realized with shock that he was still alive. Alkemade tried to move and immediately felt pain shoot through his right leg. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory of his body, checking what was broken. His right ankle hurt badly, probably sprained or broken. His back ached and his ribs felt bruised, but he could breathe normally. His hands were cut and bleeding from where he'd grabbed branches during the fall. His face was burned from the fire in the aircraft, painful but not serious. Otherwise he seemed to be intact. All his limbs moved, nothing was obviously broken. He was lying in a crater of compressed snow, surrounded by broken pine branches. His flight suit was torn to shreds, barely hanging on his body. He was wearing only socks on his feet because he'd kicked off his boots before jumping. The temperature was well below freezing, and he was starting to feel the cold. Alkemade tried to stand, but his injured ankle wouldn't support his weight. He crawled out of the snow crater and looked around, trying to orient himself. The forest was dark and silent. No sounds except the wind in the trees. He had no idea where he was, how far from the nearest town, or which direction to go. He was in Germany behind enemy lines with no equipment, no shoes, and a badly injured ankle. Survival seemed impossible, but then again he'd just survived an 18,000-foot fall without a parachute. If he could survive that, maybe he could survive this too. Alkemade began crawling through the snow, using his arms to pull himself forward. Every movement sent pain shooting through his ankle, but he forced himself to keep moving. If he stayed still, he would freeze to death within hours. He had no particular direction in mind, just moving to stay warm and hopefully find help. After crawling for about 30 minutes, he saw a light through the trees. A faint yellow glow, maybe a quarter-mile away, could be a farmhouse or a village. Alkemade knew that approaching lights meant risking capture, but he had no choice. He would either be captured or freeze to death, and capture seemed like the better option. He crawled toward the light, stopping frequently to rest his exhausted arms. The snow was soaking through his torn flight suit, and he was shivering uncontrollably. At 4:40 a.m., Nicholas Alkemade crawled out of the forest onto a dirt road. 50 yards ahead was a small farmhouse, with light showing in one window. He crawled to the front door and pounded on it with his fist. The door opened, revealing a German farmer holding a lantern. The farmer stared at Alkemade in shock, taking in the torn flight suit, the burned face, the bleeding hands. Alkemade raised his hands in surrender and said the only German words he knew: Englischer Flieger, English Airman. The farmer called the local police, who arrived 30 minutes later with 2 officers and a doctor. The doctor examined Alkemade and was astonished by what he found. Sprained right ankle, superficial burns on the face and hands, multiple bruises and lacerations. No broken bones, no internal injuries, no signs of trauma that would indicate a high-velocity impact. The doctor asked through a translator how Alkemade had been injured. Alkemade told him the truth. He'd jumped from a burning bomber at 18,000 feet without a parachute. The doctor didn't believe him. Nobody could survive a fall like that. It was physically impossible. He assumed Alkemade had bailed out at low altitude or had used a parachute that was later destroyed. The police took Alkemade to a hospital in Mönchengladbach for further treatment and interrogation. Alkemade was taken to the Mönchengladbach military hospital, where German intelligence officers were waiting. The German officers questioned Alkemade for 3 hours, trying to understand exactly what had happened. Alkemade repeated his story: the burning Lancaster, the unreachable parachute, the decision to jump. The officers were convinced he was lying, either to conceal classified information or because he was in shock. They kept asking where his parachute was, assuming he must have hidden it after landing. Alkemade insisted there was no parachute. He jumped without one because it was burning in the aircraft. The interrogation went in circles for hours, until finally one officer had an idea. If Alkemade's Lancaster had crashed, the wreckage should contain evidence of his parachute. The Germans organized a search party to find the crash site and recover any remains. On March 26, 2 days after the crash, a German military unit located the wreckage. The Lancaster had impacted in an open field about 4 miles from where Alkemade landed. The aircraft had completely disintegrated on impact, scattered across several hundred yards. The search team recovered the bodies of the 6 other crew members, all killed in the crash. They also found the remains of Alkemade's rear gun turret, burned and twisted beyond recognition. Inside the wreckage, they found Alkemade's parachute pack, still in its storage rack. The parachute had been completely consumed by fire. Nothing remained but melted metal hardware and ash. The buckles and clips that would have attached the parachute to Alkemade's harness were identifiable. This proved conclusively that the parachute had never been worn. It had burned in the aircraft. The German investigators also examined the forest where Alkemade had landed. They found the impact crater in the snow, surrounded by dozens of broken pine branches. The trajectory was clear. Alkemade had fallen through approximately 60 feet of tree before hitting the ground. Investigators measured the crater depth and examined the compressed snow and forest debris. They found small pieces of torn fabric from Alkemade's flight suit snagged on branches at various heights. The evidence confirmed Alkemade's story in every detail. He had fallen 18,000 feet without a parachute and survived. The German intelligence officers were stunned. Nothing like this had ever been documented before. They wrote a detailed report describing the incident and the physical evidence supporting it. The report concluded that Alkemade's survival was due to a combination of extraordinary circumstances. First, he had fallen through dense pine branches that slowed his descent significantly. Second, he had landed in deep snow on soft forest floor, providing maximum cushioning. Third, he had instinctively ditched heavy equipment during the fall, reducing his terminal velocity. And fourth, he had somehow maintained a stable falling position that distributed impact forces evenly. The German doctors who examined the report were particularly interested in the equipment ditching. Alkemade had thrown away his helmet, gloves, and boots before hitting the trees. These items probably weighed a combined 8 to 10 pounds, not much in absolute terms, but at terminal velocity, even small reductions in weight can affect descent rate. More importantly, ditching bulky items reduced air resistance and allowed Alkemade to fall in a more stable position. The helmet in particular had significant aerodynamic impact because it created turbulence around his head. Without the helmet, Alkemade's head was more streamlined, reducing tumbling and allowing a flatter fall. The German report estimated that ditching equipment reduced Alkemade's terminal velocity by perhaps 5 to 8 miles per hour. This might not sound significant, but at impact speeds, every mile per hour matters enormously. The difference between hitting at 120 mph versus 112 mph could be the difference between death and survival. The German Luftwaffe was so intrigued by the case that they sent a team of aviation medicine specialists to interview Alkemade. These doctors wanted to understand the physiological aspects of surviving high-altitude falls. They asked detailed questions about what Alkemade felt during the fall, his mental state, his physical sensations. Alkemade described the strange calmness he'd felt, the absence of fear or panic. The doctors said this was likely an extreme stress response, the brain shutting down non-essential emotional processing. In situations of absolute certainty of death, the human mind often enters a dissociative state. This allows the person to remain functional rather than becoming paralyzed by terror. The doctors also noted that Alkemade had remained conscious during the entire fall. Many people who fall from extreme heights lose consciousness due to oxygen deprivation or shock, but Alkemade had been breathing normally throughout the descent as air pressure increased. His consciousness allowed him to maintain body position and possibly make instinctive adjustments during the fall. The German military issued Alkemade a certificate documenting his survival. The certificate, written in both German and English, stated that he had fallen 18,000 feet without a parachute and lived. It was signed by several German officers and included technical details of the investigation. This certificate was unusual because the Germans typically didn't document Allied personnel's survival incidents. But Alkemade's case was so extraordinary that they felt compelled to create an official record. After his injuries healed, Alkemade was transferred to Stalag Luft III, a prisoner of war camp in Poland. This was the same camp where the famous Great Escape would occur 2 months later. At Stalag Luft III, Alkemade's story spread quickly among the other prisoners. Most of them didn't believe him at first. The story seemed too incredible to be true. But Alkemade had the German certificate, and several British officers who'd been shot down near the same area confirmed details. They'd heard about the Lancaster crash from German guards and knew 6 crew members had died. The fact that 1 crew member had survived without a parachute had become a subject of fascination among German personnel. Alkemade spent 13 months as a prisoner of war, from March 1944 until May 1945. He was liberated when Soviet forces overran the camp in the final weeks of the war. He returned to England in June 1945, still carrying the German certificate documenting his fall. The RAF was initially skeptical of Alkemade's story, suspecting it might be German propaganda. They conducted their own investigation, interviewing Alkemade extensively and examining the German documents. RAF intelligence contacted the German officers who'd investigated the crash, several of whom were now in Allied custody. The German officers confirmed every detail, showing photographs they'd taken of the crash site and impact crater. The RAF concluded that Alkemade's account was accurate and documented it in official records. Alkemade's survival became a subject of intense interest in aviation medicine circles. Doctors and researchers wanted to understand the exact mechanisms that had allowed him to survive. The Royal Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine conducted a detailed analysis of the incident. They calculated that Alkemade had reached terminal velocity of approximately 120 miles per hour after falling for about 12 seconds. He maintained this velocity for the remaining 70 seconds of the fall until he hit the trees. The pine branches reduced his velocity to approximately 35 to 45 miles per hour by the time he reached the snow. The snow and forest debris cushioned the final impact, spreading the force over a larger area and longer duration. The Institute estimated that the impact force Alkemade experienced was equivalent to jumping from about 12 feet onto soft ground. Still dangerous, but within the range that a human body can survive without catastrophic injury. The analysis emphasized that every factor had to align perfectly for survival. If Alkemade had landed 50 yards in any direction, he would have missed the dense trees or the deep snow. If the snowfall had been lighter or the forest floor harder, the cushioning effect would have been insufficient. If he'd been tumbling rather than falling flat, the tree impacts would have caused fatal injuries. The probability of all these factors aligning was estimated at less than 1 in 10 million. Alkemade had not just been lucky, he'd been extraordinarily, impossibly lucky. But luck alone didn't explain survival. His instinctive decision to ditch equipment had also played a role. The act of removing heavy items increased his drag coefficient slightly and reduced terminal velocity. More importantly, it prevented tumbling by eliminating asymmetric weight distribution. A falling human body naturally wants to fall in a stable spread eagle position, like a skydiver. But heavy boots or a helmet can create enough asymmetry to cause tumbling. By ditching these items, Alkemade allowed his body to fall in the most aerodynamically stable position. This stable position meant he hit the tree branches flat rather than sideways or head first. The flat orientation distributed impact forces across his entire body rather than concentrating them on one area. Aviation medicine specialists began teaching about Alkemade's case in survival training courses. While they couldn't recommend jumping without a parachute, they emphasized the importance of equipment management. If a parachute malfunctioned, ditching heavy items might provide a marginal survival advantage. More importantly, the case demonstrated that survival was possible in situations that seemed absolutely hopeless. This became relevant during the development of ejection seats and high-altitude escape systems. Engineers realized that providing some chance of survival, even a tiny one, was better than none. Alkemade's story directly influenced designs that maximized pilot survivability in extreme situations. Nicholas Alkemade returned to civilian life after the war and got a job at a chemical factory in Loughborough. He married his girlfriend Betty in 1946, and they had 2 children together. Alkemade rarely talked about his wartime experiences, preferring to put that chapter behind him. But journalists and aviation historians periodically tracked him down to ask about the fall. In interviews, Alkemade was always modest about the incident, saying he'd just been lucky. He insisted he wasn't brave for jumping. He'd simply chosen a quick death over burning alive. The fact that he survived was pure chance, not skill or courage. But aviation experts disagreed. They pointed out that his decision to ditch equipment showed good instincts under pressure. Most people in his situation would have frozen or panicked, making the fall even more deadly. Alkemade's calmness and quick thinking, even in the face of certain death, had contributed to his survival. In 1958, Alkemade was invited to speak at an RAF reunion dinner for bomber crews. He stood before several hundred veterans and told his story in detail for the first time publicly. The audience sat in stunned silence as he described jumping from the burning Lancaster. When he finished, the room erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. After the dinner, dozens of veterans approached him to shake his hand and thank him for sharing the story. Several bomber crew members said his survival gave them hope that their lost comrades might have somehow survived too. Even though logically they knew this wasn't true, Alkemade's story provided emotional comfort. It showed that sometimes, against all odds, people do survive situations that should be fatal. The story of Alkemade's fall has been featured in numerous aviation publications and television documentaries. It's often cited as the most remarkable survival incident in aviation history. The Guinness Book of World Records listed it as the highest fall without a parachute ever survived. This record stood for decades, until other similar incidents were documented, though none quite matched the circumstances. A Yugoslav flight attendant named Vesna Vulovic survived a fall from 33,000 feet in 1972, but she was inside a section of aircraft fuselage that provided some protection and slowed her descent. Alkemade fell completely free with no protection, making his survival arguably more remarkable. There have been other documented cases of people surviving falls from extreme heights. A Russian pilot survived a fall from 22,000 feet in 1942 by landing in deep snow. An American airman survived a 20,000-foot fall in 1944 after his parachute malfunctioned. Each case involved similar factors, trees or snow to cushion impact, and extraordinary luck. But what made Alkemade's case unique was that he jumped deliberately, choosing the fall over burning. The others were accidents or parachute failures where the person had no choice. Alkemade consciously decided that falling to his death was preferable to staying in the burning aircraft. That decision and the actions he took during the fall set his case apart from all others. The psychological aspects of Alkemade's survival fascinated researchers as much as the physical ones. How does a person remain calm and make rational decisions when death is absolutely certain? Most people would panic, scream, flail uselessly, making the situation worse. Alkemade did the opposite. He accepted his fate and used his final seconds to take actions that might help. Psychologists call this calm in crisis, a rare ability to maintain rational thought under extreme stress. It's most commonly seen in combat veterans and emergency responders who've trained for crisis situations. But Alkemade had no training for falling without a parachute. His calmness was purely instinctive. Some researchers suggested that his 14 previous combat missions had conditioned him to manage fear. He'd faced death repeatedly in the rear turret, watching fighters attack from distances measured in hundreds of yards. Each mission had taught him to control panic and think clearly when under fire. This mental conditioning may have been what allowed him to remain functional during the fall. The decision to ditch equipment also revealed something about human survival instincts. Alkemade said he didn't consciously think about increasing drag or reducing weight. He just felt compelled to remove the burning, restrictive gear that was causing him pain. Yet this instinctive action happened to be exactly the right thing to do aerodynamically. Some survival researchers believe humans have deep evolutionary instincts for managing falls. Our primate ancestors lived in trees and occasionally fell from significant heights. Those who instinctively spread their bodies to increase drag or grabbed branches survived more often. Over millions of years, these survival behaviors became hardwired into human neurology. Alkemade's actions during the fall may have been ancient instincts activating in a modern crisis. Nicholas Alkemade lived a quiet life after the war, working at the same chemical factory for 40 years. He retired in 1986 and spent his retirement gardening and spending time with his grandchildren. He remained healthy well into his 70s, with no lasting effects from the fall. His sprained ankle had healed completely within 6 months, and his burns left only faint scars. Medically, it was as if the fall had never happened, which baffled doctors who examined him decades later. In 1992, the BBC produced a documentary about Alkemade's survival. The program included interviews with Alkemade, now 69 years old, and recreations of the incident. Aviation experts analyzed every aspect of the fall using computer models and wind tunnel tests. They concluded that even with perfect conditions, Alkemade's survival probability was less than 0.01%. The documentary showed footage of the Mönchengladbach forest, where Alkemade had landed. The trees were still there, slightly taller after 48 years but otherwise unchanged. The camera panned up through the canopy, showing the 60 feet of branches that had saved Alkemade's life. Alkemade watched the documentary at home with his family and became emotional during the forest footage. He said it was strange to see the place where he should have died, but somehow didn't. His wife Betty said he occasionally had nightmares about the fall, even 48 years later. He'd wake up feeling like he was falling, heart pounding, disoriented. But these episodes were rare, and mostly he didn't think about what had happened. Nicholas Alkemade died on June 22, 1987, at the age of 64. The cause was heart disease unrelated to his wartime experiences. His obituary in the Times newspaper focused primarily on his miraculous survival in 1944. It described him as the man who fell from the sky and lived, a phrase that became his legacy. Alkemade was buried in Loughborough Cemetery, with military honors. Several of his fellow bomber crew veterans attended the funeral and spoke about his survival. One veteran, a former pilot, said Alkemade's story had given him comfort during his own wartime service. Knowing that someone had survived the unsurvivable made his own dangerous missions feel slightly less terrifying. The German certificate documenting Alkemade's fall was donated to the Imperial War Museum in London. It's now on permanent display in the RAF Bomber Command exhibit. The certificate is yellowed with age, written in precise German script, stamped with official military seals. Museum visitors often stop to read it, struggling to believe what it describes. An 18,000-foot fall without a parachute, documented and verified by enemy forces. The display includes photographs of the crash site and the impact crater in the snow. There's also a piece of fabric from Alkemade's torn flight suit, recovered from the forest branches. The RAF Museum at Hendon has a more extensive exhibit about Alkemade's survival. It includes his German POW identity card, personal letters, and the original BBC documentary footage. There's also a detailed diagram showing the physics of his fall and the factors that enabled survival. The exhibit explains how terminal velocity works and why ditching equipment affects descent rate. It uses Alkemade's case to teach visitors about aerodynamics and human physiology under extreme conditions. Alkemade's survival has been studied in aviation safety research for decades. His case contributed to understanding how humans survive high-velocity impacts. This research influenced the design of ejection seats, which need to protect pilots during high-speed escapes. Engineers learned that distributing impact forces over time and across surface area is crucial for survival. Modern ejection seats are designed to slow the pilot's descent, gradually using multiple parachutes. The seats also have energy-absorbing structures that compress on impact, spreading forces over several seconds. These design principles came directly from analyzing cases like Alkemade's, where impact force distribution was key. The case also influenced thinking about emergency equipment for high-altitude air crews. Designers realized that bulky equipment could make emergency escapes more dangerous. Modern flight suits are designed to be quickly removable if needed. Helmets use quick-release mechanisms that allow pilots to ditch them with one hand. These features might never be needed, but they exist partly because of lessons learned from Alkemade's experience. The story of Nicholas Alkemade has become legendary in aviation circles. It's told to new pilots during survival training as an example of extreme crisis management. The lesson isn't that you should jump without a parachute, obviously. The lesson is that even in situations that seem absolutely hopeless, taking rational action can sometimes make a difference. Alkemade didn't know that ditching equipment would help him survive. He just did something rather than nothing, and that tiny action contributed to the miracle. Aviation instructors emphasize that survival often depends on continuing to think and act, even when death seems certain. Pilots who give up and stop fighting for survival die more often than those who keep trying until the very end. Alkemade's story perfectly illustrates this principle. He kept making decisions until he hit the ground. The broader question that Alkemade's case raises is whether survival in extreme situations is ever truly impossible. Medical science says there are absolute limits to what the human body can endure. But every few years, someone survives something that should have been impossible. Falls from extreme heights, exposure to extreme temperatures, injuries that should be instantly fatal. Each case expands our understanding of human physiological limits. Alkemade's survival showed that the human body, under exactly the right circumstances, can survive impacts that would normally be fatal. This doesn't mean people should take foolish risks. The odds of survival are still infinitesimally small. But it does mean that impossible might not mean quite what we think it means. There's also a philosophical dimension to Alkemade's story that resonates with people. When faced with the choice between burning to death and falling to death, he chose the fall. It seemed like choosing how to die rather than whether to die. But by making that choice and taking action, he accidentally created a tiny possibility of survival. The universe, through an extraordinary combination of circumstances, allowed him to walk through that impossibly narrow door. People find hope in this, the idea that even when all seems lost, action might create unexpected possibilities. This isn't religion or mysticism. It's just the recognition that complex systems sometimes produce unlikely outcomes. Alkemade's survival required a million things to align perfectly, and somehow they did. The 6 other crew members on Lancaster S for Sugar weren't as fortunate. Pilot Jack Newman, navigator Charles Beaumont, bomb aimer Frank Higgins, wireless operator James Swales, flight engineer Leslie Elstub, and mid-upper gunner George Johnson all died in the crash. They were buried in the Rheinberg War Cemetery in Germany. Alkemade visited their graves in 1985, accompanied by his wife and daughter. He placed flowers on each grave and stood in silence for several minutes. His daughter later said he cried, something she'd never seen him do before. Alkemade told his family that he felt guilty for surviving when his crewmates hadn't. This is a common feeling among war survivors, often called survivor's guilt. Why did I live when they died? What made me special or more deserving? The answer, of course, is nothing. Alkemade wasn't more deserving, he was just luckier. He happened to be in the rear turret, which became separated from the main fuselage. He happened to land in the one spot where survival was possible. His crewmates had no such opportunities. They died instantly when the aircraft hit the ground. But knowing this intellectually doesn't eliminate the emotional burden of being the only survivor. Alkemade carried this burden quietly for 43 years until his death. The story of Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade continues to fascinate new generations. It's been featured in books, documentaries, podcasts, and countless online articles. People are drawn to the story because it challenges their understanding of what's possible. We live in a world governed by physical laws that seem absolute and unbreakable. Fall from 18,000 feet and you die, that's not a suggestion, it's a fact. Except Nicholas Alkemade did it and lived, which means the rule has an exception. And if that rule can be broken, what other rules might have exceptions we haven't discovered? This is why the story resonates so deeply. It suggests that reality is more flexible than we think. The technical details of Alkemade's survival have been analyzed exhaustively. Computer simulations have recreated the fall thousands of times with slight variations. The simulations confirm that survival required an almost miraculous alignment of factors. Change any single variable, tree density, snow depth, fall angle, and he dies. The margin for survival was measured in inches and seconds. If he'd fallen 10 feet to the left, he'd have missed the densest cluster of trees. If the snow had been 3 inches shallower, the impact force would have been fatal. If he'd been spinning rather than falling flat, the tree branches would have caused lethal injuries. Every variable had to be exactly right, and somehow, impossibly, they were. Modern skydivers and base jumpers find Alkemade's story particularly fascinating. These people deliberately fall from extreme heights, but always with parachutes. They understand better than anyone how lethal a fall can be if anything goes wrong. Parachute malfunctions are rare but not impossible, and every jumper knows the statistics. Alkemade's survival gives them a strange comfort. If the absolutely worst happens, survival might still be possible. Some skydivers have studied Alkemade's fall to understand optimal body position during emergency descents. If a parachute completely fails, is there any body position that might improve survival odds? The consensus is that a flat, spread eagle position is best because it maximizes drag and maintains stability. This was the position Alkemade naturally fell into after ditching his equipment. Modern survival training for military pilots includes brief discussion of unpowered descents. Instructors acknowledge that survival without a parachute is nearly impossible. But they teach that if faced with this situation, pilots should try to land in trees, snow, or water. These surfaces provide the best chance of survival, though the odds remain microscopic. Ditching heavy equipment is also taught as a potential last resort measure, not because it guarantees survival, but because it might improve odds from 0.01% to 0.01%. When death is nearly certain, even tiny improvements in odds are worth pursuing. The legacy of Nicholas Alkemade extends beyond aviation into broader survival psychology. His story is used in emergency response training to illustrate the importance of maintaining composure. Paramedics, firefighters, and disaster rescue personnel study cases of extreme survival. They learn that people who stay calm and keep taking action survive more often than those who panic. Alkemade's calmness during the fall exemplifies this principle perfectly. He accepted that death was likely, but didn't let that acceptance become paralysis. He kept thinking, kept acting, kept doing whatever seemed helpful even if the benefit was minimal. This active engagement with his situation, even in extremis, is what survival experts consider ideal behavior. As we conclude this remarkable story of how Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade survived an 18,000-foot fall, several themes stand out. First, survival in extreme situations often requires making impossible choices. Alkemade chose to jump without a parachute rather than burn to death. Both options seemed fatal. But by making a choice and acting on it, he created a tiny possibility that didn't exist otherwise. Second, instinctive actions under stress can sometimes be exactly the right actions. Alkemade didn't consciously understand aerodynamics when he ditched his equipment. But his instinct to remove restrictive gear happened to improve his survival odds. Third, survival often depends on factors completely beyond individual control. Alkemade landed in the only spot within miles where survival was possible. He had no way to steer toward that spot. He simply got impossibly lucky. Fourth, maintaining composure in crisis situations can make the difference between life and death. Alkemade's calmness allowed him to fall in a stable position and survive the tree impacts. If he'd been tumbling and flailing, the outcome would almost certainly have been different. Fifth, the human body is both incredibly fragile and surprisingly resilient. Alkemade fell 3.5 miles, and walked away with a sprained ankle. But if any of a dozen variables had been slightly different, he would have died instantly. The line between survival and death can be measured in inches and milliseconds. Nicholas Alkemade's story reminds us that the world is full of improbable events. Most improbable events are negative, accidents and disasters that shouldn't happen but do. But occasionally, improbability works in the opposite direction. Someone survives something that should kill them, and we're left marveling at how lucky they were. Alkemade's luck was extraordinary, but it wasn't pure luck. He made decisions that marginally improved his odds, even if he didn't fully understand how. He remained conscious and aware throughout the fall, allowing him to land in a survivable position. He stayed calm after impact and crawled toward help despite his injuries. Each of these actions contributed to survival, even though luck was the dominant factor. The next time you see an aircraft flying overhead, remember Nicholas Alkemade. Remember the young airman who fell from 18,000 feet and lived to tell the tale. Remember that in the darkest moments, when all hope seems lost, action is still better than paralysis. Remember that sometimes, against all odds and logic, impossible things do happen. Nicholas Alkemade didn't set out to become famous or to set any records. He was just a 21-year-old tail gunner, doing his job over enemy territory. When faced with an impossible situation, he made the best decision he could and accepted the consequences. The fact that he survived was a miracle that defied physics, probability, and common sense. His story has inspired countless people over the decades, since that night in March 1944. It's been told and retold in dozens of languages across every continent, and it will continue to be told as long as people are fascinated by the limits of human survival. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more incredible stories of survival and courage from history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from aviation enthusiasts to history lovers, and you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these remarkable stories alive.